a little further.
The dust storm came with a vengeance, swallowing the Arizona Badlands in ochre and grit. Ayanna Iron Willow fought against the howling wind, pulling the rough, woven blanket tighter around her shoulders as she trudged toward the rock overhang that served as their makeshift corral. The goat and the single, aging mare needed checking, and with the sun already sinking into a haze of swirling dirt, she couldn't wait till morning. The brutal winds of the Chiricahua Mountains, they called them viento cuchillo, the knife wind, and it felt precisely that, 1,000 tiny slicing blades of ancient grit scouring the flesh and spirit. The harsh reality of 1,880 had already claimed enough. Ayanna, or Iron Willow as her people knew her, paused to steady her breath. The small, squat dwelling behind her, built half into the hillside for protection, offered only a faint, flickering light from the oil lamp within a fragile beacon in the growing elemental chaos. Inside, her 9-year-old son, Koa, Little Wolf, slept fitfully, watched over by her mother, Taima Shadow Walker. For a moment, Ayanna considered turning back, letting the storm have its way until dawn. The instinct of self-preservation, honed by years of surviving on the knife's edge between the reservation's starvation and the open hostility of the settlers, tugged at her. But responsibility, a burden heavier than the woven blanket, pushed her forward. The livestock was not much, but it was all they had left. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a sound that did not belong to the storm or the familiar creak of the mountain. A sharp thud followed by something like a low, guttural groan. Human, not animal. Ayanna's spine stiffened, immediately reverting to the hypervigilance 2 years as a widow had enforced. The nearest white settlement, Red Rock Springs, was 15 hard miles of unforgiving terrain away, and visitors, especially those who announced their presence with a sound of collapse, did not come in a viento cuchillo. She retreated silently back toward the dwelling, slipping through the heavy wooden door into the meager living space. Above the fire pit, nestled into the stone, hung her late husband's buffalo rifle. Ayanna took it down with practiced hands more accustomed to grinding corn and preparing herbs than checking a chamber. But the training of a warrior's wife was deep. Loaded, she grabbed a small pouch of extra rounds from a hidden niche, tucking them into the folds of her clothing before heading back out into the maelstrom. The sound came again, clearer now, a dragging, scraping noise against the large slab of rock she used to barricade the overhang. Ayanna approached silently, rifle low and ready. Through the curtain of swirling dust and grit, she made out a tall, broad-shouldered figure struggling with the barrier. A land thief, perhaps, or worse, one of Captain Kincaid's patrol, trying to force entry. "Stop right there," she called, her voice a low, steady alto, an echo of the mountain's resolve, despite the frantic pounding of her heart against her ribs. "I see you. Move away from the barrier, or I will fire." The figure turned slowly. A man broad-shouldered and impossibly tall, his face obscured by a snow-crusted, wide-brimmed hat. But what caught Ayanna's attention, freezing the breath in her throat, was the dark, rapidly spreading stain across his chest, black against the light, high-collared coat in the fading, dusty light. He swayed, one hand braced against the cold rock. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible above the shriek of the wind, broken and desperate, "don't let me die like Joseph did." The words struck Ayanna like physical blows, not for their specific content, but for the raw, unmistakable plea for life in the face of inevitable death. Those same words, a final, ragged whisper of denial, had been her own husband's last moments as he bled out in the red dust. The rifle wavered in her hands. The stranger's knees buckled. He crumpled into the sand, a dark, heavy heap against the wind-whipped desert floor. Ayanna stood frozen, the rifle still aimed, her mind a frantic race between caution and instinct. It could be a trick. It could be a desperate outlaw. It could be a soldier. A soft, wet groan broke her paralysis. She moved forward, keeping the rifle ready, but her speed was now dictated by urgency. blood. Too much of it, soaking through the heavy coat, turning the pale desert sand to deep ochre. A bullet wound, recent and ugly, not something a man faked for a ruse. Ayanna glanced back at the distant light of her home, then down at the man who was bleeding out on the edge of the world. Decisions, in this life, always came quickly. Necessity had honed that skill to a fine, sharp edge. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Ayanna, she muttered, using her native name, a curse directed at the universe for this unwelcome, impossible burden, not at the dying man. She quickly checked the area, setting the rifle aside only after confirming no other figures were visible in the storm. She hooked her arms beneath his shoulders, her muscles screaming with the effort. He was impossibly heavy, a dead, unwelcome weight against her small but wire-tough frame. "If you're playing me for a fool, chill. Man," she gasped, dragging him through the shifting sand and grit, "you will wish that bullet had finished you clean." Dragging him through the storm-scoured ground toward the small compound took everything she had. Her back screamed in protest, her moccasins slipping on the loose rock. By the time they reached the door, Ayanna was gasping, her arms trembling with sheer exertion. She kicked the door open, the sudden, smoky warmth of the fire pit a welcome shock against her sand-scoured cheeks. "Mama Taima," she called, struggling to keep the man from slipping to the earthen floor. Taima, Shadow Walker, appeared from the sleeping area, a grinding stone in her gnarled, powerful hand. At 60, Taima retained the erect posture and fierce eyes of a much younger woman, though the grief of the Indian Wars and the loss of her entire way of life had carved deep, permanent lines into her face. Those ancient eyes widened at the sight before her. "Bi'alash dai, white man," she hissed, her voice a low, warning growl. "Ayanna, what have you done? He is shot. Help me get him to the table, mother," Ayanna said, already half-dragging the man across the packed earth floor, leaving a visible trail of grit, blood, and melting snow that the wind had driven in. Taima hesitated, her face a mask of conflict, the ancestral hatred of the invaders, warring with the ancient Apache code of offering aid to those facing death on their land. It was a fleeting moment. Taima, who had seen too much death, sprang into action with surprising, desperate agility, clearing the small, rough-hewn table with a single, sweeping motion. Together, they heaved the unconscious man onto it, the heavy thud echoing in the small room. "Koa?" Ayanna asked, already cutting away the stranger's coat with a worn hunting knife. "Still sleeping, thank the spirits," Taima whispered, peering at the man's face, obscured by the hat. Something, a flicker of recognition or perhaps a buried, painful memory crossed her ancient eyes, but it vanished so quickly Ayanna couldn't be sure. "Who is he, Ayanna?" "I don't know," Ayanna admitted, her concentration already focused on the wound. An ugly, red hole just below the right clavicle. Not immediately fatal, but without treatment, the constant blood loss would kill him as surely as a firing squad. But he is shot, and recently, as the daughter of a medicine woman and a warrior who'd taught her the hard lessons of the trail, Ayanna had assisted with enough crude surgeries to know what needed doing. She hadn't chosen this life of constant crisis, but she had adapted, learning to stitch skin, set bone, and deliver babies with the same precision her ancestors had shown in their traditional practices. "Boil water, Mama," she instructed, not looking up. "And bring my herb kit, the good rye whiskey we keep hidden too. We will need it for cleaning." While Taima moved swiftly, her resentment temporarily buried beneath the immediate urgency of the task, Ayanna searched the man's pockets. A folding knife, a few loose dollars, and a small leather-bound journal, its pages already darkening with his blood. "What are you doing?" Taima asked, returning with the medical kit and the jar of raw alcohol. "Searching for a name." "Checking for identification and for weapons," Ayanna corrected, setting the journal aside. "Help me get this coat off. It is heavy and soaked with death." Together, they worked the sodden garment from the unconscious man. He was well built, a body forged by hard labor and exposure, his hands calloused and thick with the history of rope and wood. "Not a city man, then," Ayanna noted. The wound looked worse now, fully exposed, angry and red against the pale skin. "The bullet is still in there," Ayana murmured, probing gently around the entry point. "I will have to cut it out." "Ayana," Taima's voice was low, heavy with warning. "Think about what you are doing. This man could be anyone. A soldier come to spy, a criminal running from Kincaid's rope. He could bring the whole desert down upon our heads. He could also be innocent." Ayana met her mother's fierce gaze steadily. "Would you have me turn him out to die in the wind, Mama?" They both knew she wouldn't. Not after her own husband's final, desperate moments. Taima's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of their shared trauma settling over her once more. "I will get the rye," she said grimly. Ayana cleaned her own hands, then the wound, working methodically as her instincts and her mother's teaching guided her. The bullet hadn't gone deep, lodged dangerously close to the collarbone, a lucky miss. She prepared her instruments, laying them out on a clean linen cloth. A small sound made her turn toward the doorway of the sleeping area. Koa, her little wolf, stood there, sleep-tousled and wide-eyed, a shadow in the dim light. "Mama," he whispered. "Koa, you should be in bed." Ayana straightened, trying to block his view of the blood-covered table. "I heard voices, and the wind is angry." His eyes fixed on the stranger. "Is he dead?" "No, my heart, but he is hurt, and I need to help him." "Go with Grandma Taima now." Ayana glanced at her mother, who moved quickly to shepherd the boy back to his room. Koa ducked under his grandmother's reaching hand. "I want to help, Mama. I am not a baby. I can help." His chin lifted with the same stubborn, unshakable resolve that had characterized his father. "You always say helping people is important, even if they are your enemy." Ayana hesitated. She didn't want him to see this raw, violent intimacy with death, but the determination in his young face was unmistakable. Like his father, once Koa set his mind to something, little could deter him. "All right," she finally conceded, her heart aching with the realization that the world had already stolen too much of his childhood innocence. "You can hand me things, but you stay at the head of the table, away from the blood." Koa nodded solemnly, taking his position on a small stool. Taima sighed, but brought a cleaner cloth for the boy to hold. "What is his name?" Koa whispered. "We don't know yet," Ayana replied, pouring the rye whiskey over her small forceps, the spirit fire of the liquid searing the metal. "He was unconscious when I found him." Koa studied the man's face with the intense, unflinching curiosity of childhood. "He looks like the pictures of the fallen ones in my father's old book," he observed, his gaze darting to a thin, pale line cutting through the stranger's right eyebrow, the ones with scars from battles. The scar, Ayana hadn't noticed it before. It gave his unconscious face a perpetual, subtle look of questioning, or perhaps grief. "All right," she said, taking a deep, fortifying breath. "I need to remove the bullet. Koa, when I ask for something, hand it to me quickly. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, his small face serious and focused on the task. "Taima," Ayana commanded, "I need you to hold him down. If he wakes during this—" "I know what to do," Taima said grimly, positioning herself to pin the man's shoulders with the surprising strength of a lifetime spent working the land. Ayana took one final, steadying breath, a prayer to the spirits of the deep earth, then inserted the forceps into the wound. The man jerked violently, a ragged groan escaping his lips, but Taima's grip held firm, and he remained mercifully unconscious. She worked quickly, probing for the metal, intensely aware of Koa's wide, solemn eyes watching her every move. "Gauze," she said, and her son handed her a clean square with trembling but steady fingers. The lamplight cast their shadows on the wall, a tableau of desperate primal effort. A woman fighting to save a stranger's life. A boy helping with tools too big for his small, brave hands. An older woman holding down a man who might be friend or fatal enemy. The scene struck Ayana with a sudden, devastating poignancy. Her son, stepping into a role no child should ever have to fill, yet doing it with a steadiness that made her heart ache with both pride and profound sorrow. The bullet came free with a slick, wet sound, dropping into the tin cup Ayana had prepared. Koa leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. "Is that what hurt him?" he asked. "Yes," Ayana answered, already pressing clean gauze against the wound. A small thing to cause so much damage, is it not? Koa nodded, his eyes darting between the bloody bullet and the unconscious man's face. Will he live, Mama? Ayana hesitated. The man had lost a lot of blood to the unforgiving desert, and infection, the silent killer of the frontier, was always a risk. I hope so, Koa. We have done what we can. The rest is up to the spirits and to him. She stitched the wound closed with neat, even sutures. Her father, the old warrior, would have been proud. Then she bandaged it tightly. Throughout the procedure, the man remained mercifully still, though his breathing had strengthened, deepening into something more than a death rattle. There, she said finally, wiping her blood-stained hands on a damp towel. Now, we wait. Koa yawned, the excitement finally giving way to bone-deep fatigue. Taima took his hand. Come along, little wolf. You have done your duty. Now it is time for sleep. This time, he didn't resist, trailing after his grandmother with one last, curious glance at the stranger on their kitchen table. When they'd gone, Ayana sagged against the cool stone wall, the adrenaline draining from her body, leaving her shaky, exhausted, and desperately cold. What had she done? Bringing this man into their precarious home, this wounded white stranger with his cryptic words that echoed the tragedy of her own loss. She glanced at the blood-soaked journal on the counter. Perhaps there were answers there, but no, that felt like a violation of the sacred law of hospitality. Instead, she turned to the more immediate task of making the man comfortable. With Taima's help, Ayana managed to move him from the kitchen table to the small, cold storeroom off the main living area. It was the only space with a narrow, stone slab bed. She removed the man's heavy boots and covered him with every blanket and shawl they owned. In the softer light of the wick lamp, his features seemed less harsh, a strong, angular jaw now slack with unconsciousness, dark, thick hair peppered with the early gray of hardship at the temples. Perhaps late 30s, perhaps 40. Hardship aged a person quickly out here, burning the youth out of them like a wildfire. His fever started before dawn. Ayana, dozing in a low chair beside him, woke to his restless movements and incoherent murmuring. She bathed his face with cool, herb-infused water, checking the wound for the first, deadly signs of infection. The skin around the stitches was red and hot to the touch, but not yet showing the angry, dark streaks that signaled a serious invasion. Joseph, he muttered, thrashing weakly against the blankets. Run. They know. Ayana pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. Hush, chill. You are safe here, in the shadows. His eyes opened briefly, startlingly blue and unfocused, filled with the fire of the fever. Can't let them find the Baron's book. No one will find anything, she soothed, unsure what he meant, but recognizing the absolute terror in his fever-bright eyes. Rest, now. He subsided, slipping back into the dark well of unconsciousness. Ayana sat back, exhaustion and an unsettling fear tugging at her. Who was this man? What kind of trouble had followed him to her secluded door? The journal. She should look. If he was running from the law, or worse, running from Captain Kincaid, she needed to know. If he was in danger, they were all in danger now. Reluctantly, she retrieved the blood-stained, leather-bound journal from the kitchen. The cover was worn smooth with handling, the pages stiff and slightly swollen from the mix of blood and grit. Many of the entries were illegible now, the ink blurred beyond recognition by the dampness. A folded, thick piece of paper slipped from between the pages, a photograph, miraculously undamaged by the journey. 3 men stood before a rough, wooden building, a saloon or a way station, their arms slung over each other's shoulders in the easy, forgotten camaraderie of friendship. Ayana's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The man on the left, smiling carelessly into the lens, was unmistakably her husband, the warrior who had been shot down 2 years ago, his face beardless and younger than she remembered. She'd never seen this photograph before, never known of its existence. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she turned it over. Written in faded, cursive English ink was a single line, JRSBOH, the Red Rock Promise, 78. O.H. Owen Hayes. Could that be the man now lying feverish in her home? S.B. The bearded man on the right was a stranger. J.R. Blank, the man in the middle, dark-haired and intense, was also a stranger, but his eyes were a startling, familiar blue. Ayanna slipped the photograph and the journal into the pocket of her dress, her mind reeling, a sudden cold premonition seizing her heart. Whatever connection this man had to Caleb, she would keep it to herself for now, at least until she understood the full, terrifying cost of the mercy she had shown. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second and tell us where you're watching from if you love Wild West love stories. The fourth day was worse than the fever. Owen Hayes' eyes opened, startlingly blue in the dim light of the storeroom, but the clarity was instantly replaced by a guarded, animalistic tension. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. When Ayanna approached with fresh water, his gaze darted around the unfamiliar, stone-walled room, settling on her with suspicion and a hint of fear. Where? His voice was a dry, raw rasp, scratchy from the desert and the fever. My home, Ayanna said, setting down the fresh bandages she'd brought. A small place in the Viento Cuchillo Valley, about 15 miles northeast of Red Rock Spring. He tried to sit up, wincing sharply as the movement pulled at the tight stitches in his shoulder. I wouldn't do that just yet, she advised, pressing him gently but firmly back onto the rough pillows. You've been shot. The bullet is out, but you lost too much blood. He submitted, the tension radiating from his body like heat. How long? 4 sunrises. You had the fever of the desert. Ayanna poured water from an earthenware pitcher into a small, clean cup. Here, small sips only. He drank obediently, his intense blue eyes never leaving her face. The directness of his gaze felt like a violation of the safe distance she kept from the world. When he'd finished, he asked, "Who are you?" Ayanna. Iron Willow. Most call me Ayanna. She set the cup aside, meeting his gaze steadily. And you? A hesitation. Brief, but heavy with calculation. Owen Hayes. Well, Mr. Hayes, you are lucky to be alive. Another hour in that storm, and you would have been a meal for the buzzards before the blood loss claimed you. Ayanna began unwrapping his bandages to check the wound. Do you remember how you got shot? Another pause. A careful lie being constructed. Disagreement. Must have been some disagreement. The wound looked better, still red, but the swelling had visibly gone down. The bullet was lodged against your bone. Half an inch lower, it would have hit something vital, she murmured, applying her special salve of plantain and yucca root to the angry skin. Wouldn't be the first time luck has taken my side. His voice was stronger now, a deep, resonant baritone with the faint, unsettling trace of an accent she couldn't place. And the men who shot you? She asked. Will they be looking for you here? They won't be looking, he said, his tone suggesting the man in question was in no condition to look for anyone, ever again. Ayanna decided not to press further. The less she knew, perhaps, the better for her and Koa. You have a son, he stated suddenly. She glanced up, surprised that he'd noticed. Yes, Koa, he is 9. He was here during. Hayes gestured vaguely toward his shoulder. He insisted on helping. A brave little wolf. A ghost of a smile touched the man's lips, a rare, transient thing that softened the hard lines of his face. Too brave sometimes. Ayanna finished with the new bandages. There is an older woman, too. My mother, Taima. Husband dead? The question came out with a gentleness that was at odds with his rugged appearance. 2 years now. Killed. Near the Red Rock Pass, she said, the words still tasting of bitter ash. Hayes nodded, accepting this without further comment. After a moment, he asked, My things? Your coat was ruined. The rest is there. Ayanna indicated a chair where his belongings lay neatly folded, including your journal. It got wet and bloody, I am afraid. His eyes flickered to the small, dark leather book. You read it? No, she answered. Not a complete lie. She hadn't read it, only looked at the photograph. He seemed to accept this, his body relaxing slightly onto the cot. Thank you for everything, Ayanna. You needed help. Not everyone would have given it to a white man. Ayanna met his gaze steadily, unflinching. No, they wouldn't. Something passed between them then, a recognition of shared experience. the knowledge that the world was often a cruel, indifferent beast, and kindness came with a price. The moment was broken by the sound of small, excited feet running down the hallway. Koa appeared in the doorway, skidding to a stop when he saw the stranger awake. "Mama, he's—" "Oh." The boy's initial excitement gave way to sudden shyness. Hayes regarded the child with genuine, quiet interest. "Hello, little wolf." Koa edged into the room. "You know my name. Your mother told me. I hear you helped patch me up." Pride straightened the boy's narrow shoulders. "I handed Mama the tools and the gauze. I was brave. Then I owe you my thanks." Hayes's tone held none of the condescension white adults often used with children of the native people. "That is important work, Koa." The boy beamed, his shyness forgotten. "Does your shoulder hurt real bad?" "I broke my arm last year when I fell from the pony. It hurt something awful." "Koa," Ayana admonished gently. "Mr. Hayes needs rest, not interrogation." "It's all right," Hayes assured her. "And yes, it hurt some, but I've had worse." "Like what?" Koa asked, his eyes wide with fascination. "Got thrown from a horse once." Hayes shifted, trying to find a comfortable position, a wince crossing his features. "Broke 3 ribs and my leg." Koa winced sympathetically. "Bet that hurt worse than a bullet." "Differently, but yes, worse in some ways," Hayes agreed. "Your mother did good work. The best I've ever seen. A doctor in town couldn't have done better." "We don't go to the doctor in town," Koa said with the blunt, painful honesty of children. "He doesn't like us since Papa." "Koa." Ayana's voice was sharper now, cutting off the painful memory. "Go help Grandma Taima with the stew now." The boy looked ready to protest, but something in his mother's expression changed his mind. "Yes, Mama." He gave Hayes one last curious, appreciative look before disappearing. "I'm sorry," Ayana said when he was gone. "He doesn't get much company." "No need to apologize. He's a good boy." Hayes studied her face, his gaze thoughtful. "Not welcome in town." Ayana busied herself straightening the already neat bedside table. "It is complicated." "Usually is," he replied. He didn't press further, which Ayana appreciated. "You should rest," she said, gathering the soiled bandages. "I will bring some broth later." Hayes caught her wrist as she turned to leave, his grip firm but not painful, a cowboy's calloused, strong hand against her own rough skin. "Ayana," he said, using her name with a soft finality. She looked back at him, startled by the contact. "I won't bring trouble to your door," he promised, his blue eyes intense. "As soon as I'm able to stand, I'll move on. I give you my word of honor." Ayana nodded, oddly affected by the intensity in his gaze, a gaze that seemed to hold its own deep, unresolved pain. "Rest, Owen Hayes. We will worry about the future, when you can stand without opening that wound." The next few days established a strange, tense routine. Hayes grew stronger, moving from the bed to a chair by the second day, taking short, wobbly walks around the small room by the third. Ayana changed his bandages, brought him meals, and limited their conversations to his recovery and the desert weather. Koa, however, had no such restraint. He spent every moment Ayana allowed in Hayes's room, peppering the man with questions about his travels, his scar, the knife fight in Montana, a fabrication, Owen admitted with a wry smile, and whether he knew how to track animals. He did. To Ayana's surprise, Hayes showed remarkable patience with the boy, answering his questions thoughtfully and telling him stories about life on the frontier, stories that carefully omitted the violence and focused on the solitude and the vast, uncorrupted beauty of the empty land. He taught Koa to tie complex, unbreakable knots with a piece of old twine and showed him how to carve simple, beautiful shapes from scrap wood Ayana provided. Watching them together brought a confusing mix of emotions. Joy at seeing her son so animated he'd been too somber, too much like a man since his father's death. Guilt that she couldn't provide this kind of quiet, male attention herself, and an unsettling, forbidden warmth at the gentle, respectful way Hayes handled Koa's endless curiosity. On the 5th day, Ayana found Hayes standing at the small, square window in his room, looking out at the scrub-covered yard. He was dressed in his own clothes, though the shirt hung looser than it had before his injury. You shouldn't be up so much, she admonished, setting down his broth bowl. I've imposed long enough. He turned from the window, a healthy color returning to his face. I can ride by tomorrow. Don't be ridiculous, she countered, her concern overriding her caution. That wound needs at least another week to heal properly. You will bleed out on the trail, and the wind will claim your horse. Ayana, he said, using her name, the hint of a smile touching his lips. Then I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't stay. I have business that needs tending. Business that got you shot? His expression closed, turning hard and distant. I've already brought enough risk to your family. I can't stay. What kind of risk? Ayana folded her arms, her voice low and firm. Mr. Hayes, if there is danger coming to my home, my family, I deserve to know. I am a warrior's wife. I am not a child. He regarded her steadily, seeming to weigh the next words carefully. I'm a Pinkerton contractor. I was hired to track down a criminal named Thaddeus Blackwood, the Baron. The man who shot me was one of his hired men. I dealt with him, but his associates. If they learn I'm here, you are all in danger. A Pinkerton, a civil authority, not a common bandit. That explained the journal likely records of his investigation and his unsettling knowledge of the world outside her valley. It might even explain the photograph of Caleb, though the thought sent a fresh wave of cold panic through her. There are others, Hayes continued, his eyes scanning the empty yard. The Baron's people, they won't stop. They are a lawless group who work for Captain Kincaid's own gain. How would they know? We are isolated, especially now, she argued. It's a risk I won't allow you to take from me. Life is risk, Mr. Hayes, Ayana sighed. At least give yourself a few more days. The wound could reopen if you ride too soon. Your honor is nothing to your dead body. He seemed about to argue further when a sound from the doorway drew their attention. Koa stood there, eyes wide with a combination of fear and excitement. You're a spy? Like in the stories? Hayes shot Ayana an apologetic look. Something like that, little wolf. Do you catch bad men? Do you have a special gun? Can you teach me to track a white man? Koa, Ayana interrupted, the urgency of the moment gone, replaced by sudden dread. Eavesdropping is rude. I wasn't eavesdropping, Mama. I was coming to tell you that Grandma Taima found Mr. Hayes's journal in the kitchen, and she is reading it. Ayana's stomach dropped. Hayes straightened, all traces of weakness vanishing immediately. Excuse me, Ayana said, already moving toward the door. Koa, stay with Mr. Hayes. She found Taima in the kitchen, the blood-stained journal open in her hands. The older woman looked up as Ayana entered, her face pale, her ancient eyes burning with a mixture of anger, fear, and profound betrayal. You had no right, Ayana hissed, keeping her voice low. Those are his private things. I had every right. Taima closed the journal with a snap. He is in our home, near my grandson. That doesn't give you permission to. He is hunting the Baron, Taima interrupted, her voice a low, fierce whisper that cut Ayana off completely. The Baron Blackwood, the man who has Kincaid in his pocket, the man who tried to put your husband in the dirt for exposing his mine operation. Ayana froze. The Baron Blackwood. The name was synonymous with all the corruption that plagued the reservation lands, the man who owned the mines and the bank, who controlled the law. How do you know that? Taima held up the journal, her gnarled hand trembling. It is all here. Names, locations, suspected crimes. He's been tracking the Baron for over a year. Ayana took the journal from Taima's hands, a cold, sick feeling growing in her stomach. But why? What is his interest in this? You should ask him that. Taima's voice was suddenly weary, defeated. But Ayana, everything is not as we thought. Not with your husband. Not with any of it. What are you talking about? Is everything all right? Both women turned to find Hayes standing in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame for support. His gaze went immediately to the journal in Ayana's hands. I see, he said quietly, his expression carefully neutral. I'll be gone by morning. Owen Hayes, Taima said suddenly, her voice regaining its strength, its old, familiar authority. Son of William Hayes, if I'm not mistaken. Hayes stilled, surprise briefly crossing his features. You knew my father? I knew of him. My husband, Taza, spoke highly of him. A good man who spoke the Apache tongue. Taima straightened, looking suddenly more formidable than Ayana had seen her in years. You have his eyes. The eyes of a man of honor, not a thief. A heavy, dangerous silence filled the kitchen. Ayana looked between them, feeling excluded from a significant, hidden exchange that stretched back into the forgotten history of her people. Would someone please explain what is going on? She finally asked, her voice tight with rising panic. Hayes looked at Taima. You haven't told her. Told me what? Ayana demanded. Taima sighed deeply. It is a long story, Ayana. One I am not sure you are ready to hear. I think I will decide that for myself. Before Taima could respond, the distant, unmistakable sound of approaching, synchronized hoofbeats reached them, a sound only a disciplined cavalry patrol would make. Ayana moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain of woven grass. Riders, she said, squinting through the afternoon glare of the dusty Sunday, 3 of them. Hayes was beside her in an instant, his previous weakness seemingly forgotten. He studied the approaching figures, his body tense, coiled like a rattlesnake. Do you know them? Ayana asked, a thread of ice running down her spine. No, but the way his hand moved instinctively to his hip told her everything. Where is your rifle? Above the fire pit. Get it, and get your mother and son out of sight. The urgent fear in his voice sparked her own. Who do you think it is? I don't know, but 3 men riding together in this area aren't likely coming for a social call. Hayes turned to Taima. Is there an escape route? Under the sleeping mat. A small tunnel, Taima pointed. Good. Take Koa and go there. Do not come out unless Ayana calls you. Taima nodded, already moving to find her grandson. Ayana retrieved the rifle, checking it was loaded as Hayes positioned himself beside the front window, partially hidden by the curtain. If it's who I think it might be, he said quietly, his voice grim, let me do the talking. And if it's not, his blue eyes met hers, hard as steel, then we may have a real problem. The riders were close now, their approach deliberate and menacing. As they drew near the house, Ayana could make out details. 3 men, well armed, wearing the familiar, hated uniform of the United States Cavalry. The leader rode a handsome bay horse, his bearing arrogant, his face familiar and cruel. It's Captain Silas Kincaid, she whispered, recognizing the detested, corrupt officer from Red Rock Springs. Hayes's expression darkened, turning to granite. Kincaid, yes, and that's Thompson, his deputy, with him. I don't know the 3rd man. Hemmings, Hayes supplied, his voice tight with controlled fury. Kincaid's right hand. They're here for me. Ayana glanced at him sharply. You know them? I know of them. There was something in his tone that raised 100 new alarms. But before she could question him further, the riders reached the yard. Stay behind me, Ayana, Hayes instructed, moving toward the door. And keep that rifle ready. This is not a man of honor you are dealing with. This is the Baron's dog. Kincaid dismounted first, his expensive coat and polished boots, marking him as a man of means and power. He was in his early 50s, with graying, close-cropped hair and the perpetually irritated look of someone who'd never been denied anything. Sheriff Thompson followed, a tall, raw-boned man whose badge glinted in the winter Sunday. Hemmings remained mounted, hands resting casually on his saddle horn. Kincaid approached the door, climbing the single, rough step with the confidence of a man who owned the entire territory. Just be still, Hayes murmured to Ayana. Let's hear what they want. A firm, authoritative knock sounded on the door. Ayana took a steadying breath, the smell of grit and wood smoke in her nostrils. She opened it, keeping the rifle visible, but lowered. Captain Kincaid, she said coolly, using his full title to remind him of their distance. This is unexpected. Kincaid removed his hat, revealing his balding pate. Iron Willow. Sorry to intrude on your quiet afternoon. We are looking for a man, a white man, a fugitive. Have you seen him? What man? Ayana asked, meeting his gaze directly. I see no one but my mother and my son. Kincaid's gaze shifted past her, hardening when he spotted Hayes, standing in the shadows of the doorway. I see you have company. Thompson, he commanded. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward, his hand moving casually toward his holster. Everything all right, Iron Willow? Perfectly fine, Ayanna said. My guest was just leaving. Guest? Thompson's cold eyes fixed on Hayes. Don't believe we've had the pleasure. Hayes moved into the light, his posture deliberately casual, despite the wave of tension that Ayanna could feel radiating from him. Owen Hayes, he introduced himself, his voice easy and familiar. Just passing through. Got caught in the knife wind a few nights back. She offered shelter. Mighty generous of you, Iron Willow, Thompson said. His eyes narrowed, lingering on her. Especially given your circumstances. The implication was clear. A native woman alone, taking in a white male stranger. The familiar, low-burning anger rose in Ayanna's chest, but she swallowed it down. Now wasn't the time to challenge his honor. As I said, he was just leaving now. Can I help you further, Captain? Actually, Kincaid interrupted smoothly. I think we'd better come in and discuss a few things. Thompson here has some questions for your guest, and I have a final settlement I need to discuss regarding your husband's incident 2 years ago. Ayanna hesitated, but Hayes's slight, almost imperceptible nod decided her. Very well. She stepped back, allowing the men to enter. The small front room seemed to shrink with their brutal, powerful presence. Kincaid took a seat without invitation, removing his gloves with precise, fastidious movements. Thompson remained standing, his gaze never leaving Hayes. Mr. Hayes, the captain said, what brings you to these parts? Hunting, sir, Hayes replied easily. Got separated from my partner in the storm. Had to seek shelter. Hunting what exactly? Whatever pays, Captain. Bounty hunting, Pinkerton investigation. A man must make his living. A cold, reptilian smile touched Kincaid's lips. Interesting profession. Dangerous, too. It has its moments, as you can see by your shoulder. Thompson cleared his throat. Iron Willow, about your husband's death. The official report states that he was killed, resisting arrest for cattle rustling. We are here to finalize the paperwork that will allow me to take over the property and clear the debt you owe. Ayanna forced herself to focus on Kincaid, though every instinct screamed to watch the tense exchange between Hayes and the captain. What debt? My husband owed no debt to you, Captain. The debt to the state. Iron Willow. Your late husband's actions cost the territory a considerable sum. I am merely recouping those losses by taking over this land for the Baron's mining operation. You can be moved to the official reservation, where you belong. Ayanna's blood ran cold. So that was it. The Baron wanted her land, had always wanted it. The land isn't for sale, and my husband was no thief. Everything has a price. Iron Willow. Kincaid's gaze slid meaningfully to Koa's sleeping area, especially when there's a child to consider. Before Ayanna could respond, Hayes spoke up, his voice dangerously soft. You seem very interested in this property, Captain. Any particular reason why a simple mining debt would require the personal attention of a man like you? Kincaid's composure slipped just for an instant, revealing something hard and ugly beneath the military veneer. Just looking out for the territory's interest, Mr. Hayes, and I warn you, an outsider's interference in a matter of state property is a dangerous thing. How noble, Hayes's tone suggested it was anything but. And Thompson's interest. Is that professional courtesy, or something more personal? Thompson's hand moved to his gun. Careful, Hayes. That sounds dangerously close to an accusation. Just an observation. Hayes remained outwardly relaxed, though Ayanna could see the tremors of restrained fury in his shoulders. 3 important men riding out in the cold to discuss a small land dispute with a native woman makes a Pinkerton man wonder about the true gold at the bottom of the mine shaft. Kincaid stood abruptly. I can see this isn't a good time. We'll continue this discussion later. Thompson. Hemmings. We ride. He fixed Ayanna with a final, chilling glare. Enjoy the land while you can, Iron Willow. The papers are already being drawn up. The 3 men left with barely concealed hostility, their spurs jingling menacingly. Ayanna watched from the window as they mounted and rode away, their postures rigid with thwarted purpose. They'll be back, Hayes said quietly, his gaze fixed on the receding figures. What was that about? Ayanna turned to him, searching his face. You know them. You know something about my husband's death. Hayes was silent for a long moment, conflict visible in his intense blue eyes. Finally, he sighed, the sound heavy with old guilt and new resolve. Kincaid is the Baron's protection. He ensures the law looks the other way. And your husband? Hayes hesitated. Tell me. I believe he was working for my brother, Joseph Reed. Joseph was a Pinkerton agent, deep undercover in Red Rock. He was investigating the Baron's operation, and I believe your husband was helping him get the evidence he needed. Ayanna stared at him, the pieces slowly, horribly falling into place. The photograph in her pocket. The man she thought was a thief was a hero. My husband wasn't a criminal. The words came out automatically, a desperate defense she'd repeated countless times. No, Hayes handed back the journal, but he knew Joseph Reed, and he knew the Baron. That puts him right in the middle of something very dangerous, something that got both of them killed. The tunnel cover creaked open, revealing Tima's grim face and Koa's wide, frightened eyes. They're gone, Tima whispered. Yes, Ayanna answered, pocketing the photograph. It is safe. Tima emerged, pulling Koa up after her. The boy looked around with wide eyes. Were those bad men, Mama? Yes, little wolf, Ayanna said, her voice hard with newfound certainty. Very bad men, and we are going to fight them. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The threat of Captain Thaddeus Kincaid's return hung over the valley like a poisonous cloud that seeped into every breath, every heartbeat. The quiet rhythm of the past few days, fires crackling in the hearth, the comfort of a child's laughter. The fragile illusion of safety was shattered in an instant. The valley no longer felt like a home. It was a trap, a waiting grave. The calm domesticity they had clung to dissolved, replaced by the sharp, metallic tension of survival. They will be back before the next sunrise, Tima said flatly, her hands steady as she packed strips of dried venison into a rawhide pouch. Her voice carried no fear, only the resigned cadence of hard-earned wisdom. She tightened the leather thong and set the pouch aside, her eyes never lifting from her task. Kincaid knows too much now. We cannot stay here, Ayanna. The fire popped, sending up a spray of sparks. Ayanna sat cross-legged on a woven blanket, her husband's hunting knife in her hand, the blade scraping against a whetstone with long, purposeful strokes. The sound was harsh in the silence. She lifted her eyes, dark with storm clouds, and countered, "But where can we go, Mama?" Her words cut as cleanly as the knife's edge. The reservation is starvation, and the open country is death. We are Chiricahua Apache. We have nowhere left to run. The knife paused in her hand, gleaming orange in the firelight. The truth of her words hung heavy between them. Tima's jaw tightened, but her hands did not falter as she packed water skins. We run to the high ground, she insisted. To the Wound Canyon. It is ancient land, Choshkai, the sacred mountain. The spirits dwell there. The white soldiers will not follow us into the heart of the holy. Ayanna shook her head grimly, her long braid brushing against her shoulder as she turned. She glanced at Owen Hayes, who leaned against the cabin door, silent as he had been through most of the discussion. His face was hard but watchful, the face of a man who had learned the price of speaking too quickly. They will, Mama, Ayanna replied, her voice low but unyielding. Kincaid and the Baron are after land and gold, not fear of the spirits. They will bring their cannons. They will bring their rifles. They will grind even sacred ground into dust if it means power. Hayes finally stirred, his deep voice steady but edged with urgency. His eyes flickered toward Koa, the small boy clinging to his grandmother's skirt, his tiny knuckles white with terror. Your mother is right, Ayanna, Hayes said. We need distance. We need high ground we can defend. But the truth is, he tapped the breast pocket where the journal lay hidden, the photograph folded inside, the evidence of a secret rotten enough to burn the Baron's empire to the ground. The real threat isn't Kincaid's rifles. It's the evidence you carry. That journal, the photograph, the link between me, your husband, and the Baron. That's why they'll never stop. They don't fear your bullets, they fear the truth written on those pages. We need to expose him, and we need to do it before he silences the last witness. He touched his chest. Before he silences me. The words struck like a hammer. The weight of the decision fell on Ayana's shoulders like an avalanche, suffocating in its enormity. Survival or justice. Two paths, both ending in blood. The first choice: flee. Run into the sanctuary of the sacred canyon, where the earth itself might offer protection. Save her son, her mother, the remnants of her people. But such survival would mean chains of a different kind. A slow, agonizing death of the spirit, waiting out the years until reservation, hunger, or white man's cruelty consumed them all. The second choice: stand and fight. Honor her dead husband by dragging truth into the light. But such honor would almost certainly mean immediate, violent death. Kincaid's mercenaries raining fire until nothing remained but ashes. The fire snapped. The silence pressed harder. At last, Ayana spoke, her voice calm, low, but carrying the unshakable weight of command. "We go to Wound Canyon," she declared. Both Taima and Hayes looked at her sharply, but not to hide. "We go to prepare. The canyon is the only place where I can gather the herbs I will need, and the only place strong enough to guard Koa and Mama, while Owen and I do what must be done." Taima's eyes softened for the first time in days, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed Koa's hair from his brow. "You choose to fight, Shiza, my daughter." Ayana's gaze burned, her husband's knife still clenched in her hand. "I choose to survive with honor intact, Mama. My husband died for a truth no one dared to tell. I will tell it." She reached for his old rifle, its wood worn smooth by his hands. "With this, with blood if I must." The escape. They left before the moon climbed high, shadows cloaking their flight. The storm had passed, but left behind its ruined mud thick and sucking, snow melting in slick sheets across the rocks. The trail was nearly impassable. Every step a battle for balance. Taima stumbled more than once, her breath harsh, but she did not complain. Koa trudged beside her, his little legs trembling with exhaustion, his spirit too stubborn to admit weakness. When he could no longer walk, Hayes swung him up onto his hip, ignoring the dull throb of his own half-healed wound. Koa's head lolled against the broad plane of his shoulder, and Hayes carried him mile after mile without complaint, his silent strength a constant reassurance. They crossed into the canyon's throat at dawn. The entrance was treacherous, sheer rock faces slick with runoff, but they climbed with the grim determination of those who had no choice but forward. By midday, they collapsed beneath a cold stone overhang, the wind screaming through the canyon walls like 1,000 knives. It was called Viento Cuchillo, the knife wind, and it lived up to its name. They huddled close, the boy asleep in Ayana's arms, his breath soft against her chest. Hayes sat apart, staring into the gray expanse. His reserve, held so tightly for so long, finally cracked. "You're right to be wary of me," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't come here for justice. I came for vengeance. I thought if I killed the Baron, the guilt would ease." Ayana looked up, her brow furrowing. "Guilt for what, Owen?" His eyes flinched away, fixed on the cracked leather of his boot. He swallowed hard. "Joseph, my brother, the Pinkerton agent. I told him he was a fool for joining the agency. Told him to quit, to come home," we argued. "I told him he was on his own. Those were the last words I ever said to him." His voice broke, and when he forced the words out, they came like jagged shards. 2 days later, he was dead, shot in the back. The canyon swallowed his confession, the silence heavy with the weight of regret. Ayana's lips parted, then closed. She knew that pain, that final, bitter memory that stabbed deeper than any knife. "The last thing I said to my husband was, 'Be careful,'" she whispered, shaking her head. "Not that I loved him, not that he was my heart, just, 'Be careful.' That was my goodbye." She swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "We never know which words will be the last. I am sorry for your brother, Owen." The air shifted. The barrier between them cracked. Their losses, different yet the same, wove them together in fragile, unspoken harmony. It was not romance yet, nor even trust, but it was recognition, the deep acknowledgement of two wounded souls walking the same road. The journalist, The following day, as they rested near a hidden spring deep within the canyon, a rider approached. The horse picked its way carefully through the rocks, its rider elegant even in dust and travel-stained clothes. Evelyn Street. Claire, a woman of the East, with pale skin and eyes too sharp for her genteel exterior, dismounted with practiced ease. "Owen Hayes," she called, urgency in her cultured voice. "I've been searching since my telegram was intercepted. Kincaid knows a Pinkerton is here. The Baron has been alerted. They've locked down every road." She turned to Ayanna, her gaze laced with something that felt uncomfortably like pity. "Iron Willow, you must know the truth about this man. His brother's wife, Caroline, she was beautiful, and Owen was very close to her. There was talk, deep talk. He is not here only for justice. He is here for a lost love. And that love, too, is tangled in the Baron's schemes." The word struck Ayanna like a rifle butt to the gut. She looked at Owen, saw the truth flicker across his face, the shame that could not be denied. "It is true," Owen admitted, his voice low. "I loved Caroline, but she is gone. My fight now is for Joseph's name and for the life of this woman and her son." He gestured toward Ayanna, toward Koa. "The past is dead." Ayanna drew in a long breath, tasting sage in the cold, thin mountain air. She looked at Evelyn, the civilized woman who judged with her tongue, then at Owen, the rough man willing to bleed for a truth that was not his. Her answer came not from reason, but from the warrior's code. "The past is dead, Evelyn," she said firmly, "but the future needs justice. What news do you bring of the Baron?" Evelyn straightened, recognizing the command in Ayanna's tone. "The Baron keeps a ledger," she said, "a book that records everything gold stolen from the government. Apache labor sold like cattle, land seized under false claims. Kincaid hides it for him. I believe it is in the abandoned Black Eagle mine near Red Rock Springs." The revelation ignited something fierce in Ayanna's eyes. "I know that place," she said, her voice sharp as flint. "Old, dangerous. But my people walked there long before the white man. I know paths even the mountains have forgotten." She looked at Owen, the decision already made. "We do not flee. We hunt. We will find this ledger. We will carry it to Cheyenne, and we will break the Baron on his own lies." The fire burned in her words. Hayes nodded, the final weight lifted from hesitation. The die was cast. The escape from the canyon was no longer a desperate flight. It was a march toward destiny, toward confrontation, toward the final reckoning. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The escape from Wound Canyon wasn't a retreat. No, it was the turn, a calculated, ruthless beginning of a counterattack, forged not in panic but in purpose. The canyon walls, scarred by gunfire and blackened with smoke, still echoed with the chaos of what had nearly destroyed them. The stench of powder lingered, the dust of collapsed rock swirled in the moonlight like ghostly specters of the men who had fallen. But the survivors did not crawl out as fugitives. They emerged as something new, something sharper, harder, bound by more than vengeance. Ayanna walked ahead, her shoulders squared, her long black hair streaked with dirt and blood, but falling with the quiet dignity of a queen. She was no longer the grieving widow whose nights were carved hollow by tears. She had fully revealed herself as Iron Willow, the warrior's wife, the keeper of an ancestral fire that no outlaw bullet could extinguish. Every step she took was guided by the weight of generations, by the whispered prayers of her people, echoing in the stone. Owen followed close behind, his revolver holstered but his jaw set. He felt different now, altered by her presence, shaped by her strength. Once, he had been the haunted avenger, chasing the shadow of a brother's ghost across the desert, his soul corroded by rage and whiskey. But the desert and Ayanna had stripped him bare and rebuilt him. Now, Owen Hayes was no longer running from grief. He was standing for something greater, the principled protector. His transformation was complete. They stopped in a clearing, the firelight dimming to coals. The canyon wind howled low, rattling the yucca plants. Ayanna crouched, drawing into the dirt with the sharpened end of a yucca root. Her finger traced a path as if unlocking secrets carved into the land itself. "The Black Eagle mine is dead ground," she said, her voice low and precise. "The entrance Kincaid knows is a kill zone. He'll leave rifles trained there until the sun rots the bones of any fool who tries." Owen leaned in, watching her hand etch winding lines. She pointed toward the canyon's base, where water spilled in silver ribbons from the cliff. "But the old ones built a spirit entrance," she continued, her dark eyes glinting in the firelight. "A back way through the waterfall at the base of the canyon. Only I know how to find it. Only my people walked there." Her words carried more than strategy, they carried a legacy, a reminder that land itself bore memory, that stones whispered and water guarded secrets. Owen studied her face in the flickering light and realized, not for the first time, that she was not just his ally, she was his teacher. The strength he had spent years searching for in whiskey and warfare was here, etched in her bones, born not of steel and powder but of connection to the earth itself. The farewell. The decision to move was made swiftly. Koa and Taima would not ride to the mine. They were too precious, too vulnerable, too tied to the blood that Kincaid's men longed to spill. Evelyn, pale but resolute, offered to hide them in the most remote cave she had charted, a fissure so deep in the canyon walls that even a hawk's shadow would never reveal it. The goodbyes were brief, but every second held the weight of eternity. Koa, small but fierce, pressed a stone into Owen's palm. It was smooth, river-polished, and warm from the boy's hand. "For luck," Koa whispered, his voice trembling but brave. Owen closed his hand around the stone, nodding, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Taima pulled her daughter close, her weathered face streaked with the tears she had fought to hold back. "Ayana," she said, her voice raw, her heart exposed in a way it rarely had been. "Use the heart of the mountain. Do not let the white man's ways consume you. Remember who you are." Ayana embraced her mother, breathing her in as if to carry her scent into battle. "I will return, Mama," she promised, her words a blade of steel wrapped in silk. Then she slung her rifle across her back and lifted the bag heavy with explosives that Owen had scavenged from abandoned supply crates. No more words. To speak further would be to unravel. They turned and left, their figures swallowed by the canyon's winding trails, the night closing behind them. The journey, the trek toward the mine, was brutal, a journey that demanded sweat, blood, and trust. The trails were invisible to an untrained eye, narrow goat paths and steep drops where the earth crumbled beneath their boots. The desert sang around them, coyotes howling from distant ridges, owls calling through the dark. Owen followed Ayana's lead, every nerve taut. Kincaid's men patrolled the obvious paths, their torches like angry stars against the cliff faces. But Ayana knew where to step, where to pause, where to let the silence itself become their camouflage. She moved with the grace of a mountain cat, her hand occasionally reaching back to steady Owen, guiding him through crevices and along razor-thin ledges. The closeness was unspoken intimacy, his hand on her waist as she leapt across a fissure, her grip on his arm as he pulled her up a slick boulder. No words, only breath, only trust. The night pressed them together, binding them tighter than any vow. Finally, the roar of falling water reached their ears. They crouched behind a cluster of rocks, watching the official entrance. As Ayana had promised, 2 of Thompson's roughest men guarded it. They were drunk, their laughter crude, whiskey bottles gleaming in the lamplight. But their rifles were close at hand, and death hovered in their careless grip. "We don't go in there," Ayana whispered, tilting her head toward the shimmering curtain of water nearby. The cascade fell from 30 feet, silver under the moon, pounding against the rocks like drums of war. "The back way. It is a sign of our people, water from the stone." The spirit entrance. The waterfall thundered in their ears as they approached. Spray soaked their clothes, the icy bite of it searing their skin. The passage behind was narrow, slick, and terrifying. The rock pressed against their backs. The roar of water deafened them, the footing treacherous. Ayana moved first, her fingers gripping hidden crevices, her body flowing like a shadow. Owen followed, clumsy by comparison, but steady. When he slipped, her hand caught him, her eyes fierce with both frustration and care. When she stumbled, he braced her, his broad shoulders anchoring them both. Each motion was wordless confirmation of their bond. They did not need vows or promises. Survival itself became their vow. When they emerged into the darkness of the mine's interior, they were soaked, shivering, and alive. The air inside was thick, musty with the smell of damp wood and old ore. Their lantern lit the way through abandoned shafts until they found a narrow, dry office carved into the stone. And there it was, the Baron's black ledger. It sat on the desk, half buried beneath a pile of manifests, the leather cracked, the gold embossing faded but unmistakable. Owen seized it, his heart hammering, his fingers trembling as he traced the letters. "This is it," he whispered hoarsely. "Every stolen dollar, every illegal land grab, every Apache life sold into labor. Kincaid's name is in here too." Ayanna stepped closer, her breath catching. Her eyes scanned the vile scrawl, the numbers that represented blood and tears. Here was the culmination of 2 years of grief and suspicion. Proof that her husband had died a hero. Proof that her people's suffering had not been imagined but calculated, bought and sold on these very pages. Her transformation was complete. No longer doubt, no longer shadow, only fire. The trap. Boots echoed in the distance, rough voices shouting, laughter cut short. Thompson's men. The guards had sobered and summoned reinforcements. "We are trapped," Owen hissed, shoving the ledger into his coat. "No," Ayanna countered, her voice calm, her eyes blazing with ancestral calculation. "We have the truth. They have a mine full of explosives and a tunnel ready to fall." She set to work quickly, her fingers sure, planting the explosives at a critical beam. Owen's hands shook as he helped, his breath ragged. "When I give the sign, you run," she ordered, her tone like steel. "I'm not leaving you," he growled. "You are the truth, Owen," she shot back, pressing the ledger harder against his chest. "Koa needs to know this truth. His father's honor is in your hands, not mine." The echo of boots drew closer. Owen's heart raced. "Owen, look at me." Ayanna grabbed his face, her hands rough but commanding. "You must live. You are my son's future." She pressed a perfect eagle feather into his palm. It was smooth, delicate, yet powerful, a sacred token. "This is a promise of my people, the final gift. Now run." He kissed her a desperate, dust-flavored kiss, short and searing, a warrior's farewell. Then, with one last nod, he turned and ran into the darkness. The explosion. The guards rounded the corner, their lanterns spilling crooked light. "There!" one shouted, raising his rifle. Ayanna did not hesitate. She hurled the ignition toward the explosives. The blast was thunder itself. A subterranean roar shook the mountain to its core. The ground heaved, rocks splintered, beams snapped. The main tunnel collapsed in an avalanche of stone and dust. The guards screamed, swallowed by the mountain's wrath. Ayanna was thrown backward, her body slamming into jagged rock. Her ears rang, her skin burned, but she was alive. Crawling through choking dust, she found the back tunnel, clawing toward the faint promise of light. She stumbled out behind the waterfall, coughing, bleeding. The ledger clutched against her chest, and there, just beyond the spray, stood Owen. His face was a storm of terror and relief. "You crazy Apache," he gasped, grabbing her, his hands skimming over her body, searching for wounds. "I told you," she panted, her lips curling into a grim smile. "You cannot hide from a warrior in the shadow of her own mountain." He held her tight, as if he would never let go again. And in that moment, soaked, broken, trembling, they both knew. They had the ledger. They had the truth. They had each other. The eagle feather gleamed in Owen's hand. The promise was alive. The pieces were set, the truth in their hands, the explosion at their backs. There was only one road left. "We ride to Red Rock," Owen said, his voice low, steady, unbreakable. He lifted Ayanna into the saddle, secured the ledger, and turned his horse toward the horizon. "We use this truth," he declared, "to burn their world down." The ride to Red Rock Springs was a blur of adrenaline, grim resolve, and the cold, thin hope of justice. Dust whipped at their faces as the moon climbed higher, silvering the endless desert like a shroud stretched across eternity. Owen Hayes leaned forward in the saddle, his jaw clenched, every muscle taut with the weight of what lay ahead. Beside him, Ayanna, known among her people as Iron Willow, rode with the stillness of a predator. Her eyes, sharp as flint, scanned the distant ridges where shadows might hide ambushes. Koa slept fitfully in the saddle between them, too exhausted from the journey and the fear of the past weeks to stay awake. They arrived under the cloak of a cold, clear night. The small, ramshackle hotel at the edge of town leaned like a weary drunk, its wooden beams bleached by decades of sun and wind. The lanterns flickered in the windows, painting long, trembling streaks of light across the dust. The single hitching post bore the scars of 100 restless horses, and it was there that Owen tethered their exhausted mount. "We don't have long," Owen whispered, scanning the hotel's upper windows. His voice was low, urgent. "Kincaid's men will smell blood soon enough. Evelyn better be here, or this is the end of it." "She is here," Ayanna replied with quiet certainty, her voice like stone against water. "The spirits told me the woman carries fear in her chest, but steel in her hands." "Red." Owen glanced at her, caught for a moment by the firelight glint in her eyes. He trusted her instincts more than his own now. Inside, the air reeked of stale tobacco and sweat. They climbed the creaking staircase, each step loud enough to betray them. At the end of the hall, a door cracked open. Evelyn Street. Claire's pale face appeared, framed by disheveled hair and wide, frightened eyes. "You came," she breathed, relief and dread tangled in her voice. She ushered them quickly into the small, dimly lit room, bolting the door behind them. The room smelled of ink, dust, and fear. Papers were scattered across the narrow desk, a leather satchel half-packed with essentials. Evelyn's hands trembled as she picked up the packet that contained the black ledger, bound in oilskin and sealed with wax. "They're hunting for you in every town between here and Santa Fe," she whispered. "If you stay, you'll die. If you run, maybe, just maybe, you'll live. But this," she lifted the packet as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, "this will kill them faster than bullets ever could." Owen took a step closer. "You've got couriers ready?" "Yes," Evelyn nodded, determination piercing through her fear. "A relay of riders, north through Kansas, then on to Cheyenne. The ledger will be in trusted hands by sunrise if we act now." "They've already tried to kill us," Ayanna said, her voice dry, calm as desert stone. "They failed. Tonight, we finish what was started. Send the ledger." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting between them. "If you go through with this plan, you'll be walking into hell. The Baron's men won't negotiate. They'll slaughter you both." Owen leaned forward, his voice a growl. "Then let them try. This isn't about survival anymore. This is about ending them, once and for all." The plan was reckless, stitched together with desperation and resolve. Owen's blunt cowboy tactics fused uneasily with Ayanna's fluid Apache strategies, but together they formed something fierce, unpredictable. They would confront Kincaid and the Baron at their source of power, the Baron's own bank using the ledger as leverage for a public confession. The whole town would witness it, no shadows to hide in, no whispered denials. Only truth, blood, and justice. The Baron's bank loomed over the main street of Red Rock Springs like a fortress of greed. Gas lamps burned inside, casting long shadows across the polished counters and stacked coin chests. Behind the heavy oak doors, Captain Thaddeus Kincaid and the Baron himself counted fresh shipments of stolen gold, their laughter ringing with cruel confidence. They didn't hear the doors burst open. "It's over, Kincaid!" Owen roared, his revolver raised, his voice booming like thunder across the wooden walls. "The ledger is gone. Your sins are already halfway to Cheyenne. Your corruption ends tonight." The room froze. For a moment, the only sound was the tick of the ornate clock on the wall. Then Kincaid's face twisted with fury. "You think you can walk in here and take us down with words?" he sneered, drawing his pistol. But Owen was not alone. Ayanna had already flanked the building, moving silent as a shadow through the back alleys. From the darkness, she sealed off the escape routes, her rifle gleaming in the dim lamplight. Thompson and Hemmings, the Baron's enforcers, stepped into the street outside, only to find themselves staring down the barrels of Evelyn's hidden allies. The battle erupted like a lightning storm. Gunfire cracked, echoing down the narrow street. Windows shattered, splinters flying like deadly hail. Owen fought with the ferocity of a man with nothing left to lose. His heart pounded not for vengeance, but for something greater: justice, born from the blood-soaked soil of Arizona. He traded shots with Kincaid, each round a brutal punctuation to years of corruption and cruelty. Meanwhile, Ayanna proved her mettle against Thompson, her movements swift, precise. She darted between shadows, her rifle steady, her voice rising in a fierce Apache war cry that rattled the bones of every man present. She was no grieving widow tonight, she was Iron Willow, unbreakable, untamed. The firefight reached its crescendo when the Baron himself, sensing the collapse of his empire, grabbed Evelyn and dragged her into the open, pressing a revolver to her temple. His face was pale, twisted in desperation. "Give me the ledger," he bellowed, spittle flying. "Bring it to me or she dies." "The ledger is gone, Baron," Ayanna shouted, stepping from the shadows, her voice ringing clear and sharp. "Your time is over." Evelyn's chest heaved, terror etched into every line of her face. And then, like a flame sparked in dry tinder, courage surged. With a sudden twist, she drove her elbow into the Baron's ribs and tore free. It was all the opening Owen needed. His revolver cracked once, the bullet grazing the Baron's arm. The weapon clattered to the ground. In the same heartbeat, Ayanna rushed forward, her cry piercing the night as she slammed into the Baron with the righteous fury of her ancestors. He went down hard, pinned beneath her, his empire collapsing in the dust. Kincaid, seeing his world unravel, let out a roar and lunged at Owen. But from the shadows emerged two figures, Koa and Taima, who had followed after the courier. Taima raised her husband's old rifle, her eyes burning with the fire of a grieving mother. The shot rang out. Kincaid screamed, clutching his shattered arm, the revolver spinning from his grip. The mighty captain of cruelty was brought low, undone not by soldiers or lawmen, but by the courage of those he had wronged. The fight was over. The Baron and Captain Kincaid lay broken, their power crushed, their confessions dragged from them by the undeniable truth of the Black Ledger. Thompson and Hemmings were hauled away in chains, their sneers silenced. Justice had finally come to Red Rock Springs. Dawn bled across the horizon, painting the desert in bruised shades of rose and gold. The town was eerily quiet, the dust still settling, the echoes of gunfire fading into memory. Evelyn packed her belongings with trembling hands, the Black Ledger secured inside her satchel. She was bound for Cheyenne, ready to publish the story of a lifetime, the story of corruption unmasked by courage, of cowboy love stories interwoven with Apache sacrifice. As she mounted her horse, she turned to Owen and Ayanna. "What you did tonight, it will echo. People will remember. Don't ever let them forget." Owen tipped his hat, weary but resolute. "Ride safe, Evelyn. You've got the harder fight now." She smiled faintly, then rode north, her figure shrinking against the vast horizon. In the jailhouse, Thompson and Hemmings sat in silence, awaiting the territorial marshal. Their reign of fear was over. The Baron and Kincaid were locked in separate cells, their faces hollow, their eyes stripped of power. And outside, in the early light, Owen and Ayanna stood together. Dust clung to their clothes, blood stained their hands, but they were alive, whole, changed. Ayanna turned to him, her dark eyes softening. For the first time, Owen saw not the widow burdened by grief, but the fierce, radiant woman who had carried him through fire. "We can go home now," Owen said softly, meaning the small compound in Viento Cuchillo Valley. But Ayanna shook her head, a smile breaking across her face like dawn itself. "That home lies in the shadow of the reservation. It is filled with ghosts. We are new now, reborn. Our home waits elsewhere." "Oh?" Taima stepped forward, Koa beside her, and nodded. "Go. Find new land, a free land. The spirits will guide your path." Owen understood. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He swung into the saddle, then extended a hand to Ayanna. She took it, her fingers warm, strong, a promise sealed in flesh and spirit. With Koa nestled securely between them, They turned their backs on Red Rock Spring. They didn't ride toward the past. They didn't ride toward the east. They rode west, into the vast, untamed prairie, where the horizon stretched endlessly, where the sun blazed like a promise yet to be fulfilled. The air was clean, the world wide open, every mile a heartbeat of freedom. Owen Hayes, the weary Pinkerton cowboy, Ayanna, the iron willow of the Apache, and Koa, carrying the hope of generation. Together, they rode not into safety, but into possibility, into love, into the future. The ledger was safe. Justice was done. But the greatest prize was what remained. The Wild West love stories they would now create, born not of loss, but of survival, not of vengeance, but of renewal. Their journey had only begun. The Apache woman begged in tears, "Don't spend money on me." But the poor farmer gave his only gun. That was what the papers in the East said about a man who'd wasted his survival on a woman he barely knew. But the truth I lived through, was a damn sight harder. And the woman I found never begged a day in her life. She was a silent, unbroken storm. The auction in Los Seamus had already been going for an hour when Daniel Ward stepped into the market square. That was the story they told. My story, the one that broke what little spirit I had left, began later that same blistering summer in a hellhole called Dusk Ridge, Arizona, and I walked in not for seed, but for a tin of powder and a quiet end to my trail. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway, to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The dust in Dusk Ridge didn't just hang in the air. It felt like powdered rust, staining everything. It settled on the sweat-caked shirts of the miners, on the peeling paint of the saloon, and on my own worn-out boots as I stepped off the boardwalk. I wasn't there for trouble. At 65 years old, my trouble was behind me, buried deep under years of bad whiskey and the bitter taste of a promise broken and never forgotten. I needed powder for my old Sharps rifle. One last box. Then maybe I'd ride up into the Mogollon Rim and find a place quiet enough to wait for the end. The shouting dragged me toward the center of the square. It wasn't the usual noise, not the drunken brawling or the high-pitched screams of a poker game gone sour. This was the slick, oily sound of commerce, twisting something human into a ledger entry. Beside the assay office, a makeshift platform had been thrown together. On it stood a man whose face was too fat for his collar, sweat glistening on his shaved head. Bartholomew Bart Gunn, the auctioneer, a man who traded in human desperation. And beside him stood Hare. She was Apache. Not just a woman, but a shadow carved from the canyons of the Southwest, her skin the color of desert clay at sunset. She wore nothing but tattered buckskin, and the rope binding her wrists to the rail was a thick, cheap thing, already cutting into her flesh. The sun beat down, turning the dust around her feet into shimmering heat. The crowd of men below miners, shiftless cowboys, and the kind of low-life scum that Dusk Ridge attracted were yelling obscenities, pointing, their faces flushed with greed and something darker. But she wasn't crying. She held her head high, the dark curtain of her hair falling over one shoulder. Her jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle working beneath her skin. Her eyes, when she lifted them, weren't glassed over with tears or fear. They were like obsidian chips, sharp, unflinching, and filled with a cold, terrifying contempt. She refused to give them the release of her pain. I stopped dead in my tracks. The auctioneer, Bart Gunn, was shouting, "Look at the spirit, unbroken, strong enough to work, strong enough to warm. Who'll give me $100, gentlemen? $100 for this piece of prime desert property." The bidding was slow, cruel, focused on breaking her pride. Each dollar was a cut, a reminder that her freedom was less valuable than a good pack mule. The woman, I heard someone hiss her name, Sita, Daystar. The crowd laughed at the name, but to me, it felt like a silent, terrible indictment. I didn't care about the powder, or the end, or my own meager future. My problem wasn't survival, it was the past. For 15 long years, I'd carried the face of Corporal Finn with me. Finn, my young rider, who died in the Apache Wars protecting a patch of desert he never knew, whispering a desperate plea as he bled out, "Promise me, Jake. Promise me you'll remember why we fight. Not for the gold, but for the decency. Don't let my death be for nothing. Decency. The word felt like a lie in this sun-baked square. But when I saw the absolute refusal in her eyes, the dignity she clung to, I heard Finn's voice like a bullet to the chest. My hand went to my side, touching the smooth, cold handle of my single possession of worth, the Colt Peacemaker, a presentation model with a silver engraving Finn's gun, given to me before he fell. It was all I had left of my honor, all I had left of the man I used to be. It was my sole retirement fund, my final defense against a lawless world. Bart Gunn slammed his hand on the platform. $75. Last call at 75. Going once, going twice. My hand rose, slow, stiff with years of arthritis and regret. $100. The voice was mine, but it sounded alien, ragged. The crowd went silent, then erupted in a wave of mockery and disbelief. I was Jake Barlow, the dried-up relic who lived like a hermit, too poor to afford a decent meal, and I'd just thrown down the value of my entire life. Look at the old fool, buying trouble with his pension, someone yelled, their laughter harsh and cruel. Bart Gunn's grin widened, revealing a gold tooth. He saw the quality of the gun in my holster, even if he didn't recognize the old man standing there. A gentleman's bid. Jake Barlow, going for the $100 to the cowboy with the shiny iron. I kept my eyes on Sita. She finally looked directly at me. Her obsidian gaze didn't hold gratitude. It held a terrible, quiet warning. Her lips barely moved, a whispered sound lost in the wind. Why? Don't spend your survival on me. I didn't answer. Honor wasn't a word you spoke out loud. It was something you did, even if it meant your ruin. I drew the Colt Peacemaker from my holster and laid it on the auction block, the silver glinting in the sun, a reflection of my broken oath. The gun, I said, my voice hoarse. It's worth more than the 100. The difference buys the rope off her wrists and keeps your filthy hands off her. The silence returned, deeper this time. A presentation Colt Peacemaker was the ultimate sacrifice of a man whose only value lay in his ability to fight. I was trading my life for hers. A shadow fell over the platform. Sheriff Marcus Thorne, a mountain of fat and malice, detached himself from the saloon doorway and strolled over, his star badge gleaming like a lie. Thorne ran Dusk Ridge like a wolf runs a sheep pen. He stopped beside Gunn, looking down at the weapon, then at me. That's a fine piece, Barlow, Thorne drawled, chewing on a wad of tobacco. You sure you want to trade your livelihood for this? Squaw, the value is not equal, and the market is rigged, Jake. The deal is done, Sheriff, I said, my gaze steady. The property is bought. My right. Or is your law weaker than a piece of paper, Thorne? Thorne smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. The law is flexible in Dusk Ridge, Jake. But I'll take the gun, and you'll remember who runs the law around here. This isn't over. He picked up the Colt, turning it in his massive hand, his eyes savoring the weight of the silver. Then, with a curt nod to Gunn, the deal was sealed. Gunn sliced the rope from Sita's wrists with a rusty knife. The rope fell away to leave angry red welts across her dark skin. Get off the block, woman, Gunn sneered. Sita didn't move fast. She stepped down from the platform with the same cold dignity she'd held throughout the ordeal, not stumbling, despite her bare feet hitting the rough dirt. She walked straight past the auctioneer and the sheriff, her eyes fixed only on me. I pulled off my heavy duster, the only good coat I owned, and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the tattered buckskin and the raw rope burns. I didn't touch her, only nodded toward the dusty trail leading out of town. We ride, I said. She followed. Her silence was louder than the jeers and the low, cruel laughter that rose from the crowd. I heard the whispers. Old fool's bought his own death warrant. She's Apache trouble. Thorne will come for them both. I didn't turn back. I had traded my gun for a woman's freedom, and my survival for a fragment of my honor. The emptiness in my holster was cold, a stark reminder of the sacrifice. But when I felt her shadow fall into step behind me, the weight on my chest, the suffocating weight of my long-held regret lifted, just enough to let me breathe. We walked toward the waiting, worn-out gelding, and the silence between us stretched, not with fear, but with a tension that felt like the cocking of a rifle ready for whatever came next. 4. Viết đoạn 21.300 chữ. We rode out of Dusk Ridge on that tired old horse, the silence between us so brittle it felt like dried